Have you ever felt like you were standing in the exact place you were meant to be, but the world around you simply refused to see it? Have you ever known, deep in your bones, that you possessed a worth others dismissed, a vision they couldn't comprehend, simply because of where you started, or where you came from? This is a story about Nari Patel, a woman who knew that feeling intimately, a woman forged in the fires of abandonment and resilience, who returned to claim not just her rightful place, but an entire empire built on the very ground her father had once left her to dust. It was a scorching Nevada afternoon, the kind where the air shimmered above the asphalt, and the only reprieve was the hum of distant air conditioners or the promise of a cold drink. Nari was just 7 years old, a tiny wisp of a girl with eyes too ancient for her face, when her father, Raj Patel, kissed her forehead, promised to be back before the stars appeared, and drove away from their small, attached apartment behind the bustling gas station he owned. He didn't just drive away from the station, he drove away from her, from the woman he'd married, from the life they had built on the edge of the desert. He vanished like a mirage, leaving behind a silence so vast it swallowed the constant clatter of the truck stop diner where Nari's mother, a woman named Clara with hands scarred from hot grease and a heart as tough as saddle leather, worked tirelessly. Clara, a waitress who spun tales of weary truckers and dreamt of escaping the endless highway, had taken Nari under her wing from the moment Raj disappeared. She wasn't Nari's biological mother, but she was the only mother Nari ever truly knew, a lifeline in a world that suddenly felt precarious and cold. Nari remembered the scent of coffee and stale cigarettes, the worn linoleum floor, the distant clang of the gas pumps. These were her earliest memories, etched into her soul. The feeling of abandonment, the ache of a missing parent, and the fierce, unyielding love of a woman who chose to stay. She learned to count change before she learned proper arithmetic, observing the endless stream of people, their hurried transactions, their fleeting expressions of desperation or relief. She saw the mechanics of the gas station, the grimy pumps, the endless rows of snacks inside the convenience store, the steady flow of fuel and money. It was a microcosm of a world, a self-sustaining ecosystem of commerce and human need. But for Nari, it was also a symbol of her father's departure, a monument to a promise broken, a constant, tangible reminder of what she had lost. She watched the trucks come and go, their massive engines roaring like the giants of some forgotten legend, carrying goods and dreams across the vast American landscape. Each departure felt like a fresh wound, a new echo of her father's receding taillights. Clara, noticing the quiet sorrow that clung to Nari like the desert dust, taught her resilience. Nari, she would say, her voice gravelly but kind, wiping her hands on a grease-stained apron. Life doesn't owe you anything, honey, but you owe yourself everything. You owe yourself the fight. And fight Nari did. She devoured books from the tiny library in town, often found curled up in the corner of a booth in the diner after hours, the only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerator. She excelled in school, driven by a quiet, burning ambition. A GED was all she could afford, but she pursued it with the intensity of someone earning a doctorate. She worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and observed the world with an analytical eye, understanding systems, recognizing patterns, seeing the unspoken needs of people and places. She built a life from the ground up, brick by painstaking brick, far away from the desert and the haunting shadow of her father's empire. She carved out her own destiny, fueled by a fierce independence and an unshakable belief that her past did not define her future. For 20 long years, the name Raj Patel was little more than a whisper of a memory, a phantom limb in her personal history. He was the man who had abandoned her, a ghost she had long since learned to live without, a chapter closed. But life, in its infinite irony, often chooses the most unexpected moments to reopen old wounds, or, in this case, to present an astonishing, bewildering opportunity. The call came on a Tuesday, cutting through the mundane rhythm of Nari's carefully constructed life. Her fingers, usually quick and precise as she balanced books for a small accounting firm, faltered. A lawyer's clipped, formal voice on the other end of the line informed her, with a detached, clinical air, that Raj Patel, her estranged father, had passed away. There was no emotion in the man's tone, no condolences offered, simply the recitation of facts: a heart attack. Sudden. Peaceful. Nari felt a strange, detached sensation, a mix of old hurt and bewildering indifference. She had mourned him long ago, mourned the father she never had. But then the lawyer's voice took a surprising turn, dropping a bombshell that rattled the very foundations of her stoicism. Raj Patel, the man who had vanished without a trace, had left her everything. Not just a token sum, not a small inheritance, but the entirety of his gas station empire. The same empire she remembered as a child, the network of desert outposts, the very land where he had last been seen driving away from her. The legal documents spoke of Patel Petroleum Holdings, a vast network of 27 gas stations, convenience stores, and attached diners, sprawling across 3 states. A testament to decades of relentless, silent growth from the humble beginnings she remembered. Nari listened, speechless, the phone feeling heavy in her hand. The image of the dusty, single gas station from her childhood shattered, replaced by a sprawling, formidable enterprise, a silent monument to a life her father had lived, a life she knew nothing about. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. He had left her with nothing, and now, from beyond the grave, he had left her everything. It felt less like a gift, and more like a challenge, a final, enigmatic test. Doubt, a familiar companion, began to whisper in her mind. What did she, a woman who had scraped and saved and built her life from the ground up on grit and a GED, know about running an empire? She understood balance sheets and the value of a hard day's work, but this was on a scale she had only ever seen in financial news reports. The lawyer's voice, now slightly more insistent, pressed for a decision. There were complexities, existing management structures, a board of directors to contend with. There was a current acting manager, a man named Julian Thorne, who had been running the day-to-day operations for years and was, according to the lawyer, expecting to step into the CEO role. The implication was clear. Nari was an outsider, an unknown quantity, a woman with a GED up against a seasoned corporate veteran. But as the lawyer spoke, a familiar spark ignited within Nari, the same fire that had driven her through her lonely childhood, through years of thankless jobs. It wasn't about the money, or even the power. It was about the principle. It was about reclaiming her narrative. Raj Patel had driven away from her as a child, but now, his legacy was drawing her back, not as a victim, but as the rightful heir. She wasn't returning to beg for love or acknowledgement. She was returning to take what was hers. I accept, Nari said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within her. Tell Mr. Thorne I'll be arriving next week. The decision made, a strange calm settled over her. The past was calling, not to haunt her, but to be reshaped. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew Julian Thorne would resent her, dismiss her, try to undermine her. But she also knew something else, something forged in the fires of her abandonment. She was a survivor, and survivors don't just endure, they conquer. The desert wind, dry and relentless, whipped around Nari as she stepped out of her modest rental car. It carried the scent of exhaust, cheap coffee, and the faint, sweet tang of gasoline, a potent, nostalgic cocktail that pulled her back 2 decades. This was it, the flagship station, the nerve center of Patel Petroleum Holdings. It wasn't the small, dusty outpost of her memory. It was a sprawling complex, a gleaming testament to her father's quiet, formidable ambition. Chrome glinted under the harsh sun, pump islands stretched endlessly, and a massive convenience store stood like a beacon, its signs brightly lit, inviting weary travelers. The aroma of fresh pastries mingled with the tang of cleaning solution, a carefully curated illusion of efficiency, and welcome. Nari, dressed in practical, unassuming clothes, dark jeans, a simple but well-made blouse, sensible shoes, looked every bit the traveler she was, not the heir she had become. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, her eyes, though observant, held no overt declaration of power. She blended, deliberately, into the background, a silent observer taking in the scene. She watched the employees, the customers, the flow of traffic, a quiet assessment already beginning. She saw the lines at the pumps, the hurried transactions inside, the weary smiles of the cashiers. She noticed the slight grimace of a mechanic wiping grease from his brow, the bored slump of a stocker restocking shelves. These were the details others missed, but Nari, honed by years of living on the edges, saw them all. A tall, impeccably dressed man emerged from the main office, his steps precise and confident. This was Julian Thorne, the current acting manager, the man who believed he was the rightful successor to the Patel empire. He was handsome, in a severe, chiseled way, with eyes that held the hard glint of ambition, and a mouth that seemed perpetually poised to utter a condescending remark. He carried himself with an air of self-importance, a man who had mastered the art of corporate posturing. He didn't even glance at Nari as she approached, assuming she was just another customer. "Miss Patel, I presume?" he finally said, his voice smooth, devoid of warmth, his eyes sweeping over her with a dismissive glance that lingered on her plain attire. It wasn't a question, but a statement laced with thinly veiled contempt. He made no effort to hide his disdain, his jaw subtly tightening, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Julian Thorne," he stated, offering a hand that felt more like a formality than a greeting. His grip was firm, almost challenging. "I must admit, your arrival is unexpected. Your father always kept his affairs, and his family, rather private." The unspoken accusation hung in the air. "You don't belong here." Nari met his gaze, her own eyes steady, revealing nothing. "Nari Patel," she replied, her voice quiet but firm, refusing to be rattled by his thinly veiled condescension. "And I'm here to assume my rightful position as CEO of Patel Petroleum Holdings." Thorne's polite mask slipped, replaced by a flicker of open disbelief. Then a patronizing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Rightful position? Ms. Patel, with all due respect, your father built this company from the ground up. He entrusted its day-to-day operations to me for the better part of a decade. I have an MBA, years of industry experience, and a proven track record. You were a child when he left. What could you possibly know about running a multi-state operation?" He gestured vaguely at the bustling station, as if to emphasize the sheer scale of the enterprise compared to her apparent lack of credentials. "I know this place," Nari stated, her gaze sweeping over the pumps, the convenience store, the distant diners. "I knew it when it was just one station, a dream. And I've learned a lot since then." Thorne scoffed, a barely audible sound of dismissal. "Sentimentality won't run a corporation, Miss Patel. Numbers do, strategy does. And I assure you, you'll find yourself out of your depth here. Perhaps a ceremonial role? A position on the board, perhaps, where your input could be guided?" His tone was designed to belittle, to reduce her to a figurehead, to relegate her to the comfortable obscurity he believed she deserved. But Nari merely smiled, a slow, knowing smile that unnerved him. "We'll see about that, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel he hadn't expected. "For now, I'd like a tour, a very thorough tour. Starting with the men and women who keep this place running, day in and day out." She looked past him, towards the employees, their faces etched with the fatigue of long shifts. Julian Thorne's carefully constructed world, built on assumptions of hierarchy and credentials, had just been shaken to its core. The battle for control, for recognition, for the very soul of Patel Petroleum Holdings had just begun. Julian Thorne's resentment was palpable, a thick, suffocating cloud that followed Nari through the gleaming corridors of Patel Petroleum Holdings. He treated her presence not as an opportunity, but as an insult, a direct challenge to his authority and his vision for the company. He saw her as an unqualified interloper, a ghost from the past haunting his meticulously crafted future. Every interaction was a thinly veiled attempt to undermine her, to expose what he perceived as her ignorance. During their first tour of the main office, he would deliberately bombard her with complex financial jargon, rattling off quarterly reports, market projections, and supply chain logistics, his eyes sharp, watching for any sign of confusion or weakness. "As you can see, Ms. Patel," he'd drone, gesturing at a complex spreadsheet projected onto a conference room wall, "our Q3 EBITDA projections indicate a slight downturn in the Midwestern markets due to unforeseen fluctuations in crude oil futures and a competitor's aggressive pricing strategy in the Iowa-Nebraska corridor. Our solution, as per my proposed strategy, involves a targeted acquisition of smaller, independent gas station chains to create an economy of scale, a move which, naturally, requires significant capital and a deep understanding of market trends." He would pause, waiting, a smug half-smile playing on his lips. He expected her to falter, to confess her lack of understanding, to defer to his superior intellect. But Nari remained impassive, listening intently, her gaze calm and steady. She wasn't just hearing the words, she was absorbing the underlying logic, identifying the assumptions, recognizing the patterns. She would ask simple, direct questions that often pierced through his corporate facade, questions about the human cost, the impact on employees, the satisfaction of the average customer. "And what impact will these acquisitions have on the existing staff in those smaller chains, Mr. Thorne? Have we considered the local communities they serve?" Nari asked, her voice quiet. Thorne would dismiss her queries with a wave of his hand. "Irrelevant to the bottom line, Miss Patel. Integration is standard procedure. Efficiencies must be achieved." His dismissal, however, served only to strengthen Nari's resolve. She understood that Thorne saw only numbers, not people. He saw assets, not livelihoods. His prejudice wasn't just about her lack of a prestigious degree. It was about his inability to see beyond the superficial, to recognize value where it wasn't presented in a traditional, quantifiable form. He resented her very existence, believing her background, the humble truck stop, the GED disqualified her entirely from leadership. He would subtly emphasize her past in meetings, referring to her as the late Mr. Patel's daughter from his early days, or making comments about getting one's hands dirty, implying a difference in class and experience. He ensured she was excluded from key strategic discussions, claiming she needed time to familiarize herself with the basics, even as he confidently presented his own sweeping plans. But Nari used his disdain to her advantage. While Thorne focused on high-level corporate maneuvers and grand strategic pronouncements, Nari spent her time doing what she did best, observing. She walked the floors of the convenience stores, not as the CEO, but as a silent customer, watching how people interacted, how products were displayed, how transactions unfolded. She visited the back offices, spoke to the shift managers, the stockers, the cleaning crews, the mechanics. She listened to their frustrations, their suggestions, their quiet pride in their work. She learned about the inefficiencies, the morale issues, the small, seemingly insignificant problems that, compounded across 27 stations, amounted to significant losses and disengagement. She saw the overworked cashier who felt undervalued, the mechanic whose equipment was outdated, the store manager who struggled to get simple repairs approved. Thorne, in his grand strategic vision, had overlooked the foundational elements that made the empire run, its people. He saw them as cogs in a machine, interchangeable and easily replaced. Nari, however, saw the hidden potential, the untapped knowledge, the quiet resilience in the eyes of every employee. She recognized herself in their daily struggles, in their desire to be seen, to be valued. She understood that true efficiency wasn't just about cutting costs. It was about investing in people, empowering them, and fostering a sense of shared purpose. She was building her own database of knowledge, far more valuable than any corporate report Thorne could generate. While he strategized in boardrooms, Nari was learning on the ground, connecting with the heartbeat of the empire, preparing for the moment when her quiet observations would become her most potent weapon. Julian Thorne's persistent efforts to marginalize Nari only strengthened her resolve and deepened her understanding of the empire's true pulse. He continued to play the part of the seasoned executive, relying on his MBA and his years of experience to assert his dominance, while subtly dismissing Nari's inquiries as naive or irrelevant. He would schedule meetings he knew she couldn't attend, or fill agendas with dense, impenetrable jargon designed to exclude her. He spoke of synergy and optimization and leveraging assets, terms that sounded impressive but often masked a fundamental disconnect from the real-world operations. Yet, Nari saw through the corporate facade. She understood that true leadership wasn't about acronyms or buzzwords, it was about genuine connection and practical solutions. Her hidden strength lay precisely in the very experiences Thorne scoffed at: her humble beginnings, her intimate familiarity with the everyday struggles of the working class, her ability to see the human element behind every transaction. She spent her days not in the executive suite, but on the floor. She learned the names of the cashiers, the mechanics, the overnight stalkers. She asked about their families, their shifts, their suggestions for improvement. She quietly observed a janitor, an older woman named Maria, painstakingly cleaning a spill in the convenience store, her movements slow but thorough. Nari noticed the lack of proper cleaning supplies, the worn-out mop, the effort Maria put into a job that others barely acknowledged. Thorne would never have noticed Maria, let alone spoken to her. To him, she was an invisible, easily replaceable part of the overhead. To Nari, Maria was a person, a valuable contributor, and her struggle was a symptom of a larger systemic problem. Nari discovered that the inventory management system Thorne championed was incredibly inefficient at the ground level, leading to constant stockouts of popular items and overstocking of slow-moving ones. She saw how cashiers struggled with an outdated point-of-sale system that caused long lines and frustrated customers. She heard about maintenance requests that went ignored for months, leading to deteriorating facilities and disgruntled employees. These weren't grand strategic failures that Thorne would highlight in a board meeting. They were the countless small cuts that bled the company slowly, eroding morale and profitability from within. Thorne, meanwhile, continued to make grand pronouncements about his vision. "We need to expand," he declared in a meeting Nari quietly attended. "Acquire more prime real estate, outmaneuver our competitors. The future is in aggressive growth, not in catering to every minor complaint from the ground level." He presented a plan to open 3 new, large-scale stations in unproven markets, a high-risk, high-reward strategy that seemed driven more by ego than by sound judgment. Nari, in contrast, focused on the details. She proposed simple, cost-effective solutions gleaned from her conversations with employees: upgrading the POS systems, providing better cleaning supplies, establishing a direct line for maintenance requests, empowering store managers to make small, immediate decisions without layers of bureaucracy. She championed training programs for staff, recognizing that an empowered, knowledgeable employee was the best investment. Thorne dismissed these suggestions as micromanagement or unnecessary expenditures. "Ms. Patel," he would say with a condescending sigh, "we are not running a corner store. These are not the concerns of a CEO. Our focus must be on macroeconomics, not the minutiae of mop buckets." He saw her focus on people as a weakness, a sign of her amateur status, further proof that she wasn't fit for the corporate world. But Nari knew better. She knew that the strength of any structure, no matter how grand, lay in the integrity of its smallest components. She wasn't just observing problems. She was gathering an arsenal of solutions, ready for the moment when the macroeconomics Thorn so valued would inevitably stumble, and her minutiae would prove to be the salvation of the entire empire. The crisis hit Patel Petroleum Holdings with the suddenness of a desert flash flood, exposing the shallow foundations of Julian Thorn's leadership. It began with whispers, then became a roar, a critical supply chain disruption, specifically impacting the fuel delivery to their most profitable cluster of stations. A key regional transport company, with whom Thorn had a long-standing, seemingly impenetrable contract, suddenly declared bankruptcy due to gross mismanagement, halting all deliveries to Patel's network in a crucial three-state area. Panic rippled through the company. Gas pumps ran dry. Customers, frustrated and fuming, drove off to competitor stations. News outlets picked up the story, plastering headlines about Patel's pain and fuel fiasco. The financial losses mounted by the hour, and, more importantly, the company's carefully cultivated reputation began to crumble. Thorn, usually so poised and confident, was visibly rattled. He stormed through the offices, barking orders, making frantic calls, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and desperation. His typical corporate solutions calling emergency meetings, assembling task forces, threatening legal action proved entirely ineffective. The problem wasn't a matter of strategy, it was a matter of physical delivery, of getting fuel into tanks, and Thorn, for all his MBA credentials, had no practical solution. He had relied solely on a single, vulnerable point in the supply chain, a common mistake made by those who only look at the top-line numbers and neglect the intricate, fragile logistics of ground operations. He had built his system on an assumed stability that, when challenged, collapsed. "We're losing millions," Thorn shouted in an emergency board meeting, his voice cracking with strain. "Our market share is plummeting. I've contacted every major hauler, but their fleets are already committed. We can't get fuel. We're bleeding dry." He paced frantically, his eyes wild, utterly out of his depth. The board members, a collection of seasoned, stern-faced individuals, looked increasingly grim. They had put their faith in Thorn, trusting his experience and proven track record. Now that trust was evaporating as quickly as the fuel from their tanks. Thorn, in his desperation, even made a public statement blaming unforeseen market volatility and unscrupulous business practices by a third-party vendor, deflecting responsibility rather than offering a solution. The media, of course, saw through it, painting a picture of corporate incompetence. During this chaos, Nari remained calm. While Thorn was running in circles, she was quietly making calls, not to corporate logistics firms, but to the people she had met on the ground. She called the manager of a small independent trucking company she'd learned about from one of her mechanics, a man named Eddie who specialized in hauling smaller loads for local businesses, often overlooked by the big corporations. She called the owner of a small family-run distribution center, whom she'd met while discreetly assessing inventory systems at a remote station. She leveraged the network of goodwill she had quietly built, the relationships she had cultivated while Thorn was busy dismissing the minutiae. She knew the smaller players, the ones who operated outside the corporate radar, the ones who were flexible and willing to help. She understood that sometimes the biggest problems are solved not by grand gestures, but by quiet, determined action and a network of trusted human connections. She wasn't just looking at spreadsheets, she was looking at maps, routes, and individual relationships forged over decades in the very world Thorn had deemed beneath him. She saw the crisis not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as an opportunity to prove the true value of her unique perspective, her hidden strength forged in the very desert dust from which she had emerged. The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Julian Thorn, sweat beading on his forehead, had just finished another frantic, circuitous explanation of the crisis, offering no real solutions, only more lamentations. The board members looked utterly defeated, their faces etched with despair as the numbers on the projector screen flashed ever-increasing losses. It was Nari's moment. She rose from her seat at the back of the room, her movements calm and deliberate, drawing every eye. Thorne gave her a dismissive glance, probably expecting some polite, irrelevant comment. Mr. Thorne, gentlemen. Nari began, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the heavy air. I believe I have a solution. Thorne scoffed openly. Miss Patel, with all due respect, this is not a time for conjecture. We are facing an existential threat. We need actionable plans, not theories. A board member, tired of Thorne's bluster, interjected. Let her speak, Julian. We're open to anything at this point. Nari nodded, ignoring Thorne's sneer. The problem, as I see it, isn't a lack of fuel, but a lack of unconventional thinking. We've been relying on a single, vulnerable supply chain, a system built for convenience, not resilience. While Mr. Thorne was focused on major haulers, I was speaking to the smaller, independent operators, the ones who understand local routes and operate with agility. She then laid out her plan, calmly, precisely. We have secured immediate, albeit smaller, deliveries from 3 regional trucking companies I've vetted over the past 2 days. These aren't the corporate giants, but nimble, local businesses. They can't cover our entire network, but they can prioritize our highest volume stations, ensuring we have fuel where it matters most, keeping our critical revenue streams flowing. She continued, her voice gaining key authority. Furthermore, I've negotiated temporary partnerships with a network of smaller, strategically located independent distributors who have excess capacity due to the very crisis that's affecting us. They are willing to work with us on short notice, bypassing the bottleneck of the larger, now defunct, transport company. She pulled up a new projection on the screen, a modified logistics map, showing new, decentralized routes, smaller, more frequent deliveries. It was a complex, multifaceted approach, but it was practical, immediate, and utterly groundbreaking in its simplicity and reliance on community networks. Thorne's face went from pale to beet red. This is absurd. Micro-hauling? Local distributors? This isn't scalable. It's an amateur patchwork, not a long-term solution for an empire. Perhaps not for an empire built on blind trust and single points of failure, Mr. Thorne, Nari countered, her gaze unwavering. But it is a solution for an empire that needs fuel in its tanks today. And once the immediate crisis is averted, we will establish a diversified, regionalized supply chain that will be robust against future disruptions. I've already drafted proposals for those long-term contracts. The board members, initially skeptical, began to nod slowly, recognition dawning in their eyes. Nari wasn't just offering a stopgap, she was offering a paradigm shift. She wasn't relying on abstract concepts. She was delivering tangible, actionable steps, born from her deep understanding of the ground operations and the people who made them run. The proof, as they say, was in the pudding. Within 24 hours of Nari's plan being implemented, fuel trucks, smaller and less imposing than the usual corporate behemoths, began to arrive at the critical Patel stations. The pumps, once dry, hummed back to life. Customers, seeing the fuel available signs, flocked back, relieved and grateful. The media, which had reveled in Patel's woes, now shifted its tone, marveling at the company's miraculous recovery and innovative problem-solving. Thorne, utterly defeated, stood by, his face a mask of bitter disbelief. His corporate solutions had failed, and the amateur patchwork of the woman he had dismissed had saved the empire. The crisis cemented Nari's authority. The board, seeing her decisive action and practical genius, immediately moved to formally appoint her CEO, a motion that passed unanimously, leaving Thorne stripped of his power and his pride. He resigned, quietly, unable to face the reality of his own misjudgment. Nari's first act as CEO was not to celebrate, but to address the entire workforce through a company-wide video message. She thanked every employee, from the mechanics to the cashiers, acknowledging their hard work, their loyalty, and their crucial role in the company's survival. She announced new initiatives, updated equipment, better benefits, a direct employee suggestion system, and an emphasis on professional development. She promised a culture where every voice was heard, every contribution valued. The transformation of Patel Petroleum Holdings under Nari's leadership was swift and profound. The once stagnant empire began to hum with a new kind of energy, not just the mechanical hum of pumps, but the vibrant, human hum of a community. Nari wasn't just a CEO, she was a leader who inspired genuine loyalty and respect. She instituted regular listening tours where she visited stations, not just the clean flagship locations, but the older, less profitable ones, spending hours talking directly to employees, understanding their challenges, and implementing their practical suggestions. The outdated point-of-sale systems were replaced with sleek, efficient ones, dramatically reducing wait times and improving customer satisfaction. Maintenance requests, once lost in a bureaucratic black hole, were now addressed swiftly thanks to a new, centralized system and empowered local managers. Employee morale soared, a tangible shift in the atmosphere of every study. On. The employees, once feeling like cogs in a giant, indifferent machine, now felt seen, heard, and valued. They knew their CEO understood their struggles, that she had literally walked in their shoes, and that her decisions were rooted in a deep, empathetic understanding of their daily lives. Profitability, far from diminishing with Nari's unconventional methods, actually increased. Customer loyalty improved dramatically as people noticed the cleaner facilities, the friendlier service, and the consistently stocked shelves. The empire wasn't just bigger, it was better, stronger, more resilient. Raj Patel, the absent father, found his own strange form of redemption through Nari's success. His final act of trust, the surprising inheritance, was a testament to a belief in her potential, perhaps a quiet acknowledgement of the grit and intelligence he must have glimpsed in her as a child. He had left her, but in leaving her the empire, he had given her the ultimate canvas to paint her own destiny, to prove her own undeniable worth. Nari, sitting in her father's old office, now fully her own, often looked at a faded photograph of a young girl standing shyly beside a gas pump, a ghost of her past. She remembered the ache of abandonment, the struggle, the years of building something from nothing. But now, that ache was replaced by a profound sense of purpose. She had taken the keys, not just to an empire, but to her own destiny. She had not only reclaimed what was hers, she had redefined it, infusing a cold, corporate structure with the warmth of humanity and the strength of true, empathetic leadership. The girl who was abandoned in the dust had returned to transform the very landscape that had once symbolized her loss, proving that the most valuable assets are rarely found on a balance sheet, but in the heart and vision of a person. What does it truly mean to see someone? Is it merely to look at their titles, their credentials, their perceived status? Or is it to look beyond the surface, to truly perceive the fire in their spirit, the resilience in their character, the hidden genius that lies beneath layers of life's challenges? Nari Patel's story is a powerful reminder that true worth is not defined by where you start, but by the grit with which you navigate your journey and the heart you bring to your purpose. It teaches us that the most profound leaders often emerge from the most unlikely places, those who have known struggle and humility, who understand the ground beneath their feet because they've walked it every step of the way. They are the ones who can truly see the unseen, hear the unspoken, and transform not just businesses, but lives. So, the next time you encounter someone in a role that might seem small, or someone whose background doesn't fit your preconceived notions of success, remember Nari. Remember that every person holds within them a universe of potential, a hidden gem waiting to be discovered. Challenge yourself to look deeper, to listen more intently, to see beyond the obvious. Because sometimes, the greatest assets are not found in boardrooms or on balance sheets, but in the quiet strength of an individual, in their unyielding spirit, and in their ability to turn the very ground they were abandoned on into the foundation of an empire. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own hidden worth. Comment below and tell us about a time you saw potential where others didn't. Let's build a world where every Nari Patel is not just seen but celebrated.